8 months ago, I was a senior program manager. Greg Chambers was my boss, director of operations. In a Q3 strategy meeting, I presented a cost reduction plan that would save the company $400K annually. Greg listened and said, "Hello, Gia's welcome. Back. My name is Riley Patterson, and I am 34 years old, and right now I am sitting in my office on the 14th floor, listening to my former boss, Greg Chambers, apologize to me for the third time in 10 minutes, and his apology is not an act of kindness, it is an act of survival. Because 6 months ago, he told me in front of 12 people that I was too emotional to ever be taken seriously in leadership, and now I am the regional director of operations, and he reports directly to me, and his performance review is due tomorrow. And he knows that I am the one who decides whether he keeps his job or not, and every word he is saying right now, every stammered excuse, every desperate justification is not regret. It is proof that I have already beaten him, and he is only now realizing how completely. Greg is sitting across from my desk, and his hands are folded in his lap, and he says, "Riley, I want you to know that I never meant to undermine you." And I look at him and I don't say anything, and he keeps talking. And he says, "I was under a lot of pressure back then, and I made comments that were inappropriate." And I say comments, and he says, "Yes, comments." And I say, "Greg, do you remember what you said?" And he says, "I said some things I shouldn't have," and I say specifically, and he shifts in his chair and says, "I may have said you were too emotional." And I lean back and I say, "You said I was too emotional to ever be taken seriously in leadership. You said it in the Q3 strategy meeting in front of the entire senior team, and you said it after I presented a cost reduction plan that would have saved the company $400,000. And he says, "I was wrong." And I say, "Yes, you were." And he says, "I'd like to make amends." And I say, "How?" And he says, "I don't know." And I say, "That's what I thought." And I let the silence sit between us. And I watch him realize that there is nothing he can offer me that I don't already have. And that is the most satisfying thing I have felt in 6 months. Let me take you back, because this confession, this apology, this moment of Greg sitting in my office trying to save his career did not start today. It started 8 months ago when I was a senior program manager and Greg was the director of operations. And he was my boss, and I reported to him, and I respected the position, even though I did not respect the man. And we were in the middle of the third quarter planning cycle, and I had been working on a proposal to consolidate 3 underperforming regional offices into one centralized hub. And I had run the numbers, and I had consulted with finance, and I had built a plan that would reduce overhead by $400,000 annually without cutting staff. And I presented it in the Q3 strategy meeting, and Greg listened, and when I finished, he said, "Riley, this is very thorough, but I don't think you're seeing the bigger picture." And I said, "What am I missing?" And he said, "You're focused on numbers, but leadership is about people." And I said, "This plan doesn't cut any positions." And he said, "It's not about positions, it's about morale and perception." And I said, "The perception right now is that we're wasting money." And he said, "Riley, you're being too emotional about this." And the room went quiet. And I said, "I'm not being emotional, I'm being accurate." And he said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You take everything personally." And I said, "I take my work seriously." And he said, "And that's admirable, but you're too emotional to ever be taken seriously in leadership." And I looked around the room and no one said anything. And I closed my laptop and I said, "Is there anything else?" And he said, "No." And I walked out. I went back to my office and I sat at my desk. And I did not cry, because I had learned a long time ago that crying at work gives people exactly what they expect. And I opened my laptop and I looked at the proposal I had spent 3 weeks building. And I saved it to a folder and I titled the folder Future Reference, and I went back to work. And I did not bring up the cost reduction plan again. And Greg never asked about it. And 3 months later, the company missed its quarterly target by 6%, and the CFO sent out an email saying we needed to find efficiencies, and I did not forward my proposal because I had learned something important, which is that some people have to fail on their own before they'll listen to anyone else. 4 months after that meeting, I got a call from an executive recruiter who said she was working with a client who was looking for a regional director of operations. And did I have experience with cost management and consolidation? And I said yes. And she said, would I be interested in interviewing? And I said, tell me about the company. And she said, it's the same company you work for now. And I went very still. And I said, I work for this company. And she said, yes, this is an internal search, but we're handling it externally to keep it confidential. And I said, who would I be reporting to? And she said, the VP of Strategic Operations. And I said, who currently holds the regional director role? And she said, it's a new position they're creating. It is part of a restructure. And I said, would Greg Chambers report to this role? And she said yes. And I said, I'm very interested. I interviewed 3 times. I met with the VP. I met with the CFO. I met with 2 board members. And in every interview, I presented the same cost reduction plan that Greg had dismissed 8 months earlier, and I updated the numbers, and I expanded the scope. And I showed how the model could be applied across all regions, not just one, and the CFO looked at the plan and said, this is exactly what we need. And I said, I've been ready to implement this for 8 months, and he said, why hasn't this been done? And I said, you'd have to ask Greg Chambers. And he wrote something down, and the interview continued. And 2 weeks later, I got the offer, and I accepted, and my start date was 30 days out. And during those 30 days, the company announced a restructure, and Greg's role was being absorbed into the new regional director position, and he would now report to whoever was hired, and the announcement went out on a Friday, and I watched the company intranet light up with speculation about who the new director would be. And Greg sent me an email that said, Riley, I know this is a strange time, but I want you to know I've valued working with you. And I didn't respond. My first day in the new role was a Monday, and I had a meeting scheduled with Greg at 10 a.m. And he walked into my office, and he stopped when he saw me sitting behind the desk. And he said, Riley, and I said, hi, Greg, have a seat. And he said, I didn't. No, you were, and I said, the new regional director. Yes, and he sat down, and he said, congratulations. And I said, thank you. And he said, I'm looking forward to working with you. And I said, are you? And he said, of course. And I said, good, because we have a lot to talk about. And I pulled up the cost reduction plan on my screen, and I said, I'm implementing this starting next quarter. And he looked at the screen, and his face changed. And he said, this is the plan you presented last year. And I said, 8 months ago, yes. And he said, I thought we decided not to move forward with that. And I said, you decided not to move forward with it. I'm deciding differently. And he said, Riley, I don't think this is the right approach. And I said, I'm not asking for your opinion, Greg. I'm telling you what we're doing. And he said, I have concerns. And I said, noted. And I said, you'll be leading the implementation for your region. And he said, that's a lot of work. And I said, yes, it is. And he said, I'm not sure I have the capacity. And I said, then we'll need to talk about whether this role is the right fit for you. And he went very quiet. And I said, do you have any other questions? And he said, no. And I said, great. I'll send you the project plan by end of week. And he stood up and he left. And I sat at my desk and I felt absolutely nothing. And that was when I knew I had won. Over the next 3 months, I restructured the department, I consolidated the offices, I implemented the cost reduction plan, and the company saved $520,000 in the first quarter, and the CFO sent me an email that